Thanks for tuning in to the Tor Coffee channel. Great to have you here with me today. Today, in this video, I'm going to be doing the second in a series of videos on defending premillennialism. Now, if you're watching this video, chances are you've watched the last one, and I'm going to put the last one in the link because I really think and recommend you watch the last one before you watch this one, because the last one explains my rationale for why I'm doing this, and I don't want to rehash all that here. So what I said I'd do in the last video, I'm doing in this video, and I'm going to provide you sources in the early church that provide evidence of a belief in premillennialism. And I'm going to focus in this video and the next in just the second century. I'm going to just be focusing in on the second century to establish that premillennialism existed in the early church. Now, that in itself doesn't mean it's right, but I just want to demonstrate that that is a fact, and I think it bears a lot of weight. Okay, and funny, one of my friends who I love said, "Are you sure your seminary professors didn't just tell you the second century church believed in premillennialism?" And I'm like, wow, I mean, you really don't know? Like, it's there, you know. And I know a lot of people, I mean, that with all due respect, have not seen these quotes. And I want to provide that for you. Okay. Now, just a quick little rehash of some of the things I said. Today you have classical premillennialism and you have dispensational premillennialism. And there are different kinds of classical premillennialism today, and there are different kinds of dispensational premillennialism today. And I made the point in the last video that the distinction even between dispensational and classical is not always clear cut. For example, if you're more of a progressive dispensationalist like myself, people are going to see a lot of similarity with some forms of classic premillennialism. So sometimes the charge that, well, if premillennialism was in the early church, it wasn't dispensational. So, and then they just, you know, it just seems to be a dismissal. And I'm like, so what if it wasn't dispensational? It was premillennialism. At least there was premillennialism. And again, it's a little bit more complicated by that, because there's different forms of dispensationalism today. There's not just like one dispensationalism. So I get all that in the last video. I'm not going to rehash all that here. Another reason that argument is simplistic is that in the early second century church itself, there wasn't one form of premillennialism. There were two. There was the Asiatic school that took a more literal approach to revelation and prophecy, and then there was the Barnabite school that took a more allegorical approach. They were both premillennial, though, interestingly enough, but there were two different approaches. Now, in the last video, the allegorical, I wasn't sure for a moment if it was Hermas or Barnabas, but it's definitely Barnabas. All right, so without any further ado, my introductions always take a little longer than I want. I'm going to get right to it. So today, we're going to look at the second century. In the next video, Lord willing, I will look at two more church fathers in the second century. But today, we're going to look at Papias, and we're going to be looking at Barnabas, second century fathers. Now, I have to give you a little bit by way of introduction. I will be reading some quotes that aren't directly related to the millennium itself, but they're relevant to this whole discussion. And I want to share with you a little bit about the way I'm going to do this, because I do want to give you sources. I do want to quote sources for you so that you can look them up on your own. And I want to kind of explain that a little bit about how I'm going to do that. So I'm using the Apostolic Fathers, Greek texts and English translations by 3rd edition by Michael W. Holmes. If you're really interested in this, and even if you're a post-millennialist or amillennialist, and you have the respect to listen to this argument, I really would ask you to get a copy of the Apostolic Fathers, particularly this one, so you could, you know, follow along more easily with me. But any copy of the Apostolic Fathers will do the job. But I'm using Michael W. Holmes. And he is, for Papias, for example, Papias, we don't have an existing work. Like in the Apostolic Fathers, you've got Clement, you've got Ignatius. They have existing whole works that we can quote, give you chapter and verse. Papias only has fragments of his works, and a lot of those are other church fathers quoting Papias. So we only have fragments of Papias. So as I'm quoting these different fragments, I have to give you the original source. For example, one of those will be Eusebius. So I'll quote Eusebius, and I'll give you the work and any other information that's pertinent to Eusebius's original work. Now, the way it's quoted in Michael Holmes, the original, the ancient source, is quoted in a modern source that either translates or recounts the information of an ancient source, and it gives you the page numbers of that source too. I'm not going to quote those. A lot of those are long, a lot of those are another language, and I'm not going to quote those. So I'm just going to give you a brief quote of the original source, but that should be enough to get you going. But again, if you get yourself a copy of this, you'll be able to see where that ancient source is quoted and get the exact page numbers, okay? So I've got that. I've also got Eusebius's church history, because he'll come into play, and we'll talk about that in a moment too. So let me just give you a little bit of the background on Papias that Michael Holmes recounts before we get to his quotes, because I think it's important. Papias, bishop of Hierapolis in Asia Minor, who is probably best known as the author of the 5-volume work entitled Expositions of the Sayings of the Lord, appears to have been well respected and widely quoted during the early centuries of the church. Yet today only scattered fragments of his work survive, and then only as quotations embedded in later writings. Furthermore, next to nothing is known about this man, who by all appearances was one of the leading figures of the post-apostolic era. It is not known when Papias was born or when he died. Irenaeus reports that Papias knew the Apostle John and was a contemporary of Polycarp of Smyrna. Okay, so you're going to estimate Papias lived sometime between AD 70 to AD 160. Okay, little background there about Papias. Now, let's get to our first quote from the fragments of Papias. Okay, and I'm reading under the first heading there that I have highlighted, and that is from Eusebius, who is the first church historian. In fact, he has a work called the Ecclesiastical History that we'll quote from. But this is from his chronicle, this quote. Irenaeus and others record that John the theologian and apostle survived until the time of Trajan. After this, Papias of Hierapolis and Polycarp, bishop of Smyrna, both of whom had heard him, became well known. So here Eusebius is telling us that Irenaeus, who was also 2nd century father, we'll look at more next week. Irenaeus was a disciple of Papias, and Irenaeus said that Papias heard directly from the Apostle John. So that's pretty significant. If he heard from the guy who wrote Revelation, his views on the millennium are pretty important to consider. Okay, the next thing I'm going to quote from is Eusebius's church history, or ecclesiastical history as it's often called, 3:39. That's how it's quoted. And just to give you an idea of how that works, you might think of 39 as like a verse, but it really doesn't work that way. So you see, this is Eusebius, book 3. So when it's saying 3, it's referring to book 3. And then it's referring to number 39, okay? And it, we may think like, oh, that's like a verse, okay? I'm still learning how to do church history too, and to look up these sources is a little different from today. But 39 is not simply a verse, as you could see there. That's 39, and it goes on to the next page, and it goes on to the next page, and it goes on to the next page. Okay, now obviously this is a modern that's got pictures and stuff. That wasn't part of the original. But 39 is a whole long section. Now, I do know that in some versions you'll have 3:39, and then you'll kind of have like verses. So I guess 30. In those days they wrote books. Books were kind of like chapters. So the book is 3, and then I guess let's just say you have the chapter 39, and then you see the 39 is a huge, huge section. So in many of the versions it'll have numbers, but mine doesn't have numbers, and Michael Holmes doesn't quote a number. So if you get Eusebius's church history and go to 39, you'll have to scan, but you'll find the quotes that we're talking about. So here's the next quote from Eusebius, his church history 3.39. So says Irenaeus. Yet Papias himself, in the preface to his discourses, indicates that he was by no means a hearer eyewitness of the apostles, but shows by the language he uses that he received the matters of faith from those who had heard them. So Eusebius is saying that, by the way, Eusebius is a 4th century father. He had a position in Constantine's court. He was an amillennialist. Some may debate that he was postmillennialist. He did not like premillennialism. And so what's ironic is he's going to critique Papias's premillennialism, we'll see. But what's funny about that is by doing that, he provides evidence of earlier church, even to Eusebius in the 4th century, premillennialism. So this 4th century father who's amillennial is going to be critiquing this 2nd century father who's premillennial, but in doing so, he shows premillennialism was in the 2nd century church. Okay? Premillennialism was in and it's documented. Their claim is that premillennialism is the most documented position in the 2nd century church. And so here Eusebius is saying that Papias himself says, remember, we only have fragments of Papias, and a lot of them are quotes from Eusebius. The Papias said he never heard of the apostles, but he heard from those who heard from the apostles, so a generation removed. And I'm honest. I want to be transparent. We're doing history here. I'm a premillennialist. I would love it if Papias heard directly from the guy who wrote Revelation, the apostle himself. That would give a lot of weight to his views. But I got to be honest that there's some debate about that, and we can't be certain. Also on that note, in the same section, Eusebius continues, here it is worth noting that he lists twice the name of John. The first he mentions in connection with Peter and James and Matthew and the rest of the apostles, clearly meaning the evangelists, the apostle John. But he classes the other John with outside the number of the apostles by changing the word and putting Aristean before him, and he distinctly calls him elder. So there were 2 Johns. There was a John the elder, and there was a John the apostle. And so Eusebius believes that Papias heard from John the elder. Let me just finish the quote. Moreover, by these remarks he confirms the truth of the story told by those who have said that there were 2 men in Asia who had the same name, and that there were 2 tombs in Ephesus, each of which even today is said to be John's. It is important to notice this, for it is probably the second, unless one prefers the first, who saw the revelation that circulates under the name John. So Eusebius thought that Papias heard from John the elder. I would say, though, either way, Papias was still very close to the apostles. So whether he heard directly from John, which is what I think, but we don't know, or a generation removed, a disciple of John, or this John the elder, he's still very, very close to the apostles. Okay, so that'll be enough on that. Let's get to the millennium now. Okay, and this is in that same section, Ecclesiastical History 339. And this is Eusebius talking about Papias's millennial beliefs. Among other things, he says that after the resurrection of the dead, there will be a period of 1,000 years when the kingdom of Christ will be set up in material form on this earth. These ideas, I suppose, he got through a misunderstanding of the apostolic accounts, not realizing that the things recorded in figurative language were spoken by them mystically. For he certainly appears to be a man of very little intelligence, as one may judge from his own words. Yet he was the reason that so many ecclesiastical writers after him held the same opinion, on the grounds that he was a man of the early period, like Irenaeus, for example, and anyone else who has expressed similar ideas. Now, this is gold. Let's just go through this real quick, and this is the best of the quotes attributed to Papias. So Eusebius says that Papias believes in a resurrection of the dead, and that there will be a period of 1,000 years when the kingdom of Christ will be set up in material form on this earth. That's a future millennial kingdom with Christ reigning on the earth. Then Eusebius says, I suppose he got these ideas through a misunderstanding of the apostolic account. So he's saying Papias misunderstood the apostles. Imagine a man, possibly the disciple of the apostle John, though Eusebius didn't believe that, but still close. Eusebius is saying he misunderstood the apostles, this guy that was so close. Is it impossible? No. But I don't know. I would give the guy a little more credit, I think. But anyway, let's go on. Then Eusebius is not realizing that the things are recorded in figurative language which were spoken by them mystically. So Eusebius is saying these things are to be understood allegorically, mystically. Remember, Eusebius, well, I didn't tell you this, but some of you may know, Eusebius was a student of Origen. Origen was of the Alexandrian school. Going back to Clement of Alexandria, was a more allegorical way of interpreting the Bible, in opposition to the Antiochian school, which took a little more literal approach to Scripture. Okay, so this debate is not just going on now; it was going on in the early church. Remember, the church fathers didn't all believe the same thing. They had disagreements. Even church fathers who were premillennial disagreed amongst each other. That's why you can't be so simplistic when it comes to the early church and just say, well, they all believe this or that. And that applies to a lot of things. But Eusebius belonged to this allegorical school that took Scripture more allegorically. Okay? And then he's kind of mean. He says, for he certainly appears to be a man of very little intelligence, as one may say, judging from his own words. Kind of mean, and kind of like, I don't know what it is sometimes with post-millennial and amillennial. I mean, I love you all, and maybe we're mean too, but it's just this kind of dismissal, that's stupid. Yeah, that's been around for thousands of years, and it's just very interesting to me. Yet he was the reason that so many ecclesiastical writers, church writers, after him held the same opinion. So there were a lot of, Eusebius is saying that many people took the premillennial position, and he's basically saying here a lot of them took it because Papias was a man of the early period. So otherwise, being so early in church history, what he believed, being a prominent church father, carried weight. Okay, and I would say, that's what we're getting at today. This carries weight. It doesn't settle the argument, but it carries weight. And Eusebius, who did not like premillennialism, acknowledged that. Okay, it says on the grounds that he was a man of the early period, like Irenaeus, for example, and anyone else who expressed similar ideas. Irenaeus, we'll look at next time, was a follower of Papias. Okay, so that's the main quote. I have a lot more. I don't know how much I'm going to get through because I know YouTube, people typically don't watch our videos. Just another interesting thing, Papias is one of the people that said Mark was Peter's interpreter. Okay, I just saw that. That's not really what our discussion is about, but just another fun fact. Okay, let's just do a few more here on Papias. Philip of Side in the 5th century, in his church history. This is Philip of Side in the 5th century in his church history. And he said, and Papias is also in error regarding the millennium, and so is Irenaeus, who follows him. So again, another guy that was not a premillennialist, and saying these guys were in error, but he acknowledges that they held to premillennialism. Jerome, Latin Vulgate, in his work on illustrious men, chapter 18, he says this about, well, let me just read the quote. He is the one who is to have promulgated the Jewish tradition of a millennium, and he is followed by Irenaeus, Apollinarius, and others who say that after the resurrection of the Lord, let me read that right, who say that after the resurrection, the Lord will reign in the flesh with the saints. So he is speaking about Papias. Papias is the one, he's saying, who spread this Jewish tradition. It was considered a Jewish tradition of a millennium. And he said Irenaeus, Apollinarius, and others followed him. Okay, so again, Jerome has given us evidence of premillennialism in the early church. Doesn't seem to like it, but gives us evidence. Just want to, in all transparency, give you this quote. And this is going to be from, um, okay, let's see here. Anastasius of Sinai, Consideration on the Hexameron, if I'm saying that right, okay? Um, he says that Papias interpreted the sayings about paradise spiritually and referred them to the Church of Christ. So some see here in Papias a belief that the church replaced Israel. Okay, so I don't want to I'm saying I want to say that I want to include that just to say I don't want to just give one side. See, sometimes church fathers are going to say things that will agree with both sides, and all sides of the debate will like some things they say and they won't like some things they say. Just like Catholics and Protestants today, some church fathers are going to say great things about justification by faith, but then they're going to say things about works. And Catholics and Protestants debate where they are. The men were who they were. They weren't a monolithic group, okay? And so we just have to take them for who they were. So that's there. Just want to let you know. Let's see here. There's a quote here from Irenaeus of Lyons. It's Irenaeus. It's Irenaeus. Sometimes I say it the wrong way. Forgive me if I'm inconsistent, but it's supposed to be Irenaeus, not Irenaeus. I think I say this, but Irenaeus. Let me save his quote for next week. It is in regard to Papias, but we're going to look at Irenaeus next week. And so let me save his quote for next week. Maximum the Confessor, on his Scholia on Dionysius the Areopagite, on the Ecclesiastical History, chapter 7, he says, for this Papias, in the 4th book of his Expositions of the Lord, mentioned food among the sources of enjoyment in the resurrection. Later on, Apollinarius believed this doctrine, which some referred to as the millennium. And Irenaeus of Lyons says the same thing in the 5th book of his Against Heresies and cites this in support of his statements, the above mentioned Papias, and cites in support of his statements the above mentioned Papias. So Irenaeus cites Papias. Okay. There's other quotes here from a guy, Photius, in the 9th century, in his Bibliotheca 232. We'll talk about how in the kingdom of heaven there will be enjoyment of certain material foods. Again, premillennialism believes Jesus is going to physically reign on this earth on a physical earthly kingdom. Okay, here I think we're just about wrapping up with Papias. There's let's see here. Okay, I'll give you the last two I have highlighted. Okay, and so this is from John of Dara in the 9th century in his work on the resurrection of bodies in 2:13 in that work. He says, therefore, Apollinarius the heretic, together with his companions, abandoned all this brilliant splendor of the living words. He became as blind to the truth as to the Jews. He dared to say, particularly like the Pharisees, that after the resurrection of the dead, he would live again for 1,000 years on earth in Jerusalem with the Messiah, enjoying physical pleasures and offering childish sacrifices and earthly libations before him. He continues, John of Dara, he continues, also in a similar manner, Irenaeus, bishop of Lyon and Gaul, strayed in these matters and were conveyed from the book of Papias, as Eusebius recalls. So you have this 9th century father who doesn't like premillennialism. And premillennialism, it was in the early church, 2nd, 3rd centuries. I would say it started to go out of fashion in the 4th, okay, around the time of Eusebius and Constantine. And for 1,000 years, it wasn't liked. It wasn't the dominant position for 1,000 years. It starts to come back slowly after the Reformation and before John Darby, by the way. But that's for another matter. So John Dara, 9th century, agreeing with Eusebius of the 4th in his critique of the 2nd century fathers, Papias and Irenaeus. Irenaeus is so important. We'll look at him next week. And our last quote today is again from John of Dara on the heavenly and the earthly hierarchy. He says, Papias, bishop of Hierapolis in Asia, who was discipled with John the Evangelist, says in the fourth book of Expositions of the Lord that pleasures will come through foods in the resurrection. And even Irenaeus says the same thing in a discourse against heresy, citing testimony from Papias' book. Afterward, he embraced this doctrine of Apollinarius. Okay, so again, doesn't like premillennialism, but getting evidence that it was there. I think I'm saying Hierapolis right. I'm not sure if the H is silent or not. But you see, with church history, I hope you see, you got to be careful. And I look, and I listen to a lot of these post-millennial vloggers, their videos, and I love these guys. But the church history is careless sometimes. Some of them are very careful, but a lot of the prominent ones, um, they're not. They're not. This takes work. You gotta look at the sources. You can't just cite off what you heard someone say, like my friend thought I was doing. My professors, no, I'm getting to the original sources. Now, look, I don't want these videos to be more than a half hour. I do pray you watch it. So let me just go to Barnabas, the Epistle of Barnabas. This was written sometime, probably the mid-second century. This is very likely not the apostolic Barnabas, okay? But the Epistle of Barnabas, it's included among the apostolic fathers. Very allegorical approach to Scripture. Definitely believed that the church was taking over for Israel, and there's a lot of nuances to that debate on both sides. That's another story. That's another thing that's got to be looked at in depth. But definitely took that view. Very allegorical, very symbolic, a very different premillennialism than Papias's. Very symbolic. Doesn't use a lot of the New Testament. Definitely doesn't use Revelation in his writing. And we wouldn't even necessarily agree with this quote about premillennialism and everything that goes into it, but all it does demonstrate is that premillennialism did exist in the second century church. You had the more Asiatic, literal form of premillennialism, and then the more allegorical form of premillennialism, which I think eventually turned into amillennialism. But premillennialism is the most documented form in the early church. It definitely wasn't the only position in the second century. We'll see a quote from Justin Martyr next time that demonstrates that, but it was the most well documented. So let me just read you all of Barnabas here, a few comments, and then we'll call it a video. Get a quick drink here. So Barnabas says this in the Epistle to Barnabas, chapter 15. Furthermore, concerning the Sabbath, it is also written in the 10 words that he spoke to Moses face to face on Mount Sinai, and sanctify the Lord's Sabbath with clean hands and a clean heart. And in another place he says, if my children guard the Sabbath, then I will bestow my mercy upon them. He speaks of the Sabbath at the beginning of the creation. And God made the works of his hands in 6 days, and finished on the seventh day, and rested on it, and sanctified it. Observe, children, what he finished in 6 days means. It means this, that in 6,000 years the Lord will bring everything to an end, for with him a day signifies 1,000 years. And he himself bears me witness when he says, behold, the day of the Lord will be as 1,000 years. Therefore, children, in 6 days, that is in 6,000 years, everything will be brought to an end. And he rested on the seventh day. This means when his Son comes, he will destroy the time of the lawless one, and will judge the ungodly, and will change the sun and the moon and the stars, and then he will truly rest on the seventh day. Furthermore, he says, you shall sanctify it with clean hands and a clean heart. If therefore anyone now is able, by being clean of heart, to sanctify the day that God sanctified, we have been deceived in every respect. But if that is not the case, accordingly, then we will truly rest and sanctified only when we ourselves will be able to do so, after being judged and receiving the promise. When lawlessness no longer exists and all things have been made new by the Lord, then we will be able to sanctify it, because we ourselves will have been sanctified first. Finally, he says to them, I cannot stand your new moons and Sabbaths. You see what he means? It is not the present Sabbaths that are acceptable to me, but the one that I have made. On that Sabbath, after I have set everything at rest, I will create the beginning of an 8th day, which is the beginning of another world. This is why we spend the 8th day in celebration, the day on which Jesus both arose from the dead and, after appearing again, ascended into heaven. The eighth day is also the first day. Barnabas is referring to our celebration of the Lord's Day. And he's saying that the days of creation and the days of the week are analogous to the eras of history. So he's saying that as there's 6 days of creation, there's 6 long periods, 6,000-year periods of history. And then he talks about a 7th day. And this can't be the 7th day that's a Sabbath, a time of rest and time of peace. And this can't be the new heavens and the earth, because he says that starts the 8th day. The new creation starts the 8th day. So he's talking about this 7th period of 1,000 years between the 6,000 and the beginning of the new creation, which he says is on the 8th day. There's this 7th period, and that's what we would call the millennium. We as premillennialists believe that we're in history now. History's been playing out. We do believe there's going to be a new heavens and a new earth coming, but we believe between this age and the new heavens and the new earth, there's going to be a millennial period. And by the way, I would say this isn't a theological video, a systematic theological video. It's a church history video. There's a connection between the millennium and the new heavens and the new earth, but that's for a different discussion. And it's interesting when he talks about, him resting on the 7th day. He says, this means when his son comes, he will destroy the time of the lawless one and will judge the ungodly and will change the sun and the moon and the stars. And then he will truly rest on the 7th day. And so Barnabas seems to believe in a future tribulation with a lawless one, an antichrist, that Jesus is going to come and defeat. And then there will be a 7th day, a period of rest. And then after this period of rest, the new creation will start. That sounds a lot like the millennium. Now, I don't hold, and most premillennialists today don't hold this scheme of 6,000 years. We don't know how long history is going to go for. It could go for a lot longer. But we're not quoting these guys to say we agree with them all. We're just quoting them to say there was premillennialism in the early church. And these premillennialists disagreed from one another, indeed, but premillennialism was indeed in the early church. So that's for this video. And the next video, we'll look at Irenaeus. We'll look at Justin Martyr and see what they have to say. Thanks so much for tuning in to the Torcoffee channel. I'll see you next time.